She ordered the black teen to leave the pool, certain no one would challenge her, until the girl's father arrived, and the entire country club fell silent. The midday sun bathed Wellington Country Club in golden light, casting crisp shadows over the immaculate lawns. It was the kind of place where the scent of freshly cut grass mixed with sunscreen, where laughter bounced off private cabanas, and where select families lounged under striped umbrellas while uniformed waiters discreetly topped off their drinks. For Imani Carter, stepping into this world felt like entering another reality. She wasn't a stranger to privilege. Her father, Governor Everett Carter, had ensured she had every opportunity. But country clubs like this carried an unspoken message, a silent distinction between those who belonged and those who didn't. Still, she wasn't intimidated. She had every right to be there. Her best friend, Madeline Henderson, had spent the whole summer insisting she come. "You'll love it," Maddie had assured her. "The pool is massive, the food is top tier, and trust me, the lifeguards alone are worth the trip." Imani had laughed it off, but hesitation lingered beneath her amusement. She knew how places like this worked, the silent scrutiny in the eyes of certain guests, the lingering glances that questioned her presence. But Maddie was persistent, and today, Imani had run out of excuses. The Hendersons' car pulled up that afternoon, Maddie grinning beside Imani in the back seat. "I told Mom you were coming, so she added you to our guest list," Maddie reassured her. "No big deal." Imani smiled at the effort but couldn't shake the lingering doubt. "You're sure no one's going to have a problem with me being there?" Maddie scoffed. "Of course not. My parents love you." But that wasn't really the question, and they both knew it. The club's entrance loomed ahead, a sprawling Mediterranean-style building, its grand columns gleaming in the sunlight. The moment they stepped inside, cool air conditioning washed over them, a sharp contrast to the thick Georgia heat outside. At the front desk, the receptionist barely looked up as Maddie signed them in. No questions, no hesitation. Imani exhaled softly. Maybe this wouldn't be so bad after all. Minutes later, they were poolside. The scent of chlorine hung heavy in the air, mingling with the sounds of splashing water and lazy summer chatter. Imani set her bag down on a lounge chair, slipped off her sandals, and let her gaze settle on the water, shimmering, inviting. Maddie nudged her playfully. "Told you it's nice." Imani smirked. All right, you win." She stepped forward, dipping her toes in. The water was refreshingly cool, easing the tension she hadn't even realized she was holding. Just as she was about to lower herself in, a voice cut through the air. "Excuse me, young lady." It was sharp, clipped, the kind of voice that expected immediate obedience. Imani turned, squinting against the sunlight. A woman stood before her, arms crossed, lips pressed into a thin line. Blonde bob, oversized sunglasses perched atop her head, a pastel tennis dress that had likely never seen a court. Imani recognized the type. "I'm sorry, but this pool is for members only," the woman said, her tone making it clear she wasn't sorry at all. Imani blinked. "I'm with Madeline. She signed me in." The woman's eyes flickered to Maddie, then back to Imani, as if deciding how to respond. And just like that, the air shifted. This wasn't about club rules. But Imani wasn't about to back down. For a moment, the only sounds were the rhythmic splashes of water and the distant hum of families enjoying their afternoon. Imani met the woman's gaze, calm, unwavering. Imani recognized that look instantly. The pursed lips, the scrutinizing stare, the subtle tilt of the chin, like she was sizing something up, deciding if it belonged. Before the silence could stretch any longer, Maddie jumped in. "Mrs. Lancaster, my mom signed Imani in. As my guest, she's allowed to be here." Judith Lancaster barely acknowledged her. "I don't recall seeing her name on the list." Maddie scoffed. "That's because my mom handles it online. You can check with the front desk if you want." Imani remained quiet, watching the exchange unfold. She could already tell, this wasn't about rules. Mrs. Lancaster wasn't looking for an explanation. She was looking for an excuse. And now, she had one. The woman's gaze flicked back to Imani. "I'm sorry, sweetheart, but rules are rules." Imani felt her jaw clench. I understand, she replied evenly. But I was signed in properly. I wouldn't be here otherwise. Mrs. Lancaster let out a breathy, amused chuckle, shaking her head slightly. Oh, I don't mean to be difficult, but we have policies for a reason. It helps keep things organized. Organized. Right. Maddie's face was turning red. This is ridiculous. My mom. It's fine, Imani cut in, her voice calm but resolute. She wasn't about to argue for the right to be somewhere she had been invited. Without another word, she reached for her bag, ready to walk straight to the front desk. Imani was ready to handle this herself, to shut it down before it spiraled any further. But then, just a few feet away, she heard it, a murmur. Low voices. A couple reclining in nearby loungers, watching. The lifeguard shifting uncomfortably on his perch. They were waiting. Watching. She knew this moment too well, had lived through different versions of it before. This wasn't just about a name on a guest list. Mrs. Lancaster wasn't looking for clarification. She was waiting for Imani to second-guess herself, to feel out of place. And that was exactly why Imani refused to. She met Mrs. Lancaster's gaze head-on. You can check with the front desk, she said coolly. I'm not going anywhere. A beat of silence. Before Mrs. Lancaster could respond, Maddie grabbed Imani's hand and huffed, Come on. She tugged Imani toward the cabana. I'm so over this. They walked away, shoulders squared, heads high. But even as they put distance between themselves and the confrontation, the weight of a dozen stares trailed after them. This wasn't over. Imani could feel it. Under the shade of a striped umbrella, they settled into lounge chairs. Maddie was still fuming, arms crossed, foot tapping aggressively against the concrete. I cannot believe her, she muttered. Who even is she? She's not management. She doesn't run this place. Imani exhaled, rolling her shoulders, trying to shake off the tension. She's just another person who thinks she gets to decide who belongs and who doesn't. Maddie sat up, eyes flashing. That's so messed up. And she literally saw me sign you in. Imani let her head rest against the chair. It's whatever. But it wasn't. The stares still lingered, pressing in from the edges of her vision. Some people pretended not to notice. Others watched openly, waiting to see what would happen next. Just as she was about to suggest they head to the snack bar to shake it off, a voice boomed across the pool deck. I told you, she needs to leave. Imani sat up. Mrs. Lancaster was back. And this time, she wasn't alone. A tall, wiry man in a navy polo stood beside her, his club name tag gleaming in the sunlight. Security. Maddie shot to her feet. Are you serious right now? Mrs. Lancaster's smile was tight. Triumphant. If there was a miscommunication, I do apologize, she said, her voice dripping with faux politeness. But non-members can't use the pool. It's a simple policy. The security officer hesitated. The security officer's gaze flicked uncertainly between Maddie and Imani. Imani exhaled slowly, keeping her hands loose at her sides, her expression unreadable. She refused to let Mrs. Lancaster see her waver. I already told you, I'm a guest, she said evenly. Maddie's family signed me in. Maddie, no longer holding back, stepped forward. You can literally check with my mom, she snapped. This is insane. The security officer hesitated. Miss, if there's been a mistake. There is no mistake, Maddie interrupted, her voice sharp. Why don't you check the system instead of just taking her word for it? Mrs. Lancaster's lips pursed. But before she could respond, a deep voice cut through the air. I think that's a great idea. Everything stopped. The security guard straightened. Conversations around the pool halted mid-sentence. A hush settled over the entire deck. Imani turned toward the voice, her chest tightening. Standing just beyond the lounge chairs, hands casually tucked into his pockets, was Everett Carter. Her father. Governor of Georgia. The man whose name was etched onto the Wellington Country Club's donor wall at the front entrance. And judging by the way Mrs. Lancaster's face went ghostly pale, She knew exactly who he was. The tension thickened, pressing down on the space like a held breath. Every pair of eyes locked onto the man who had just spoken. Everett Carter wasn't a man who needed to raise his voice to command a room. He wasn't the type to flaunt his authority or bark orders. But there was something about him. A quiet gravity. A presence that demanded attention. He stepped forward, his polished shoes tapping lightly against the stone pavement. His gaze flicked to Imani first, checking on her. Then, it landed on Mrs. Lancaster. "I don't believe we've met," he said, voice calm, composed. "You are." Mrs. Lancaster swallowed hard. Her lips parted as if to respond, but no words came. Beside her, the security officer, now visibly uncomfortable, took a half-step back, recognizing exactly what kind of situation he'd walked into. Everett's gaze didn't waver. "You seem very concerned about my daughter's presence." "Oh, I'd love to hear why," Everett said smoothly. Mrs. Lancaster finally found her voice, though it wavered. I was just ensuring that the club's policies were being followed, Governor Carter," she stammered, her earlier confidence unraveling. Everett gave a slow, measured nod. "That's fair. I'd expect nothing less. But tell me, did you personally check the guest list before asking my daughter to leave?" Silence. Imani watched as the woman's expression shifted, her mind scrambling for an answer. Everett turned to the security officer. "Did you check the guest list before getting involved?" The man hesitated, then shook his head. I was just following up on a complaint." Everett's face remained unreadable. "I see. So an accusation was enough to call security on a teenage girl." Mrs. Lancaster let out a nervous, airy laugh, waving a dismissive hand. "Governor, this is just a misunderstanding." Everett tilted his head slightly. "Is it?" She faltered. I thought she might have entered without signing in properly. Maddie had had enough." "That's a lie," she snapped. "You watched me sign her in." Mrs. Lancaster's jaw clenched. Everett let the silence stretch, allowing the weight of the moment to settle over the pool deck. Then, he exhaled slowly. "This club prides itself on being exclusive," he said, his voice calm but laced with meaning. "But I'd hate to think exclusion and discrimination are being mistaken for policy." At that, Mrs. Lancaster's eyes widened. A flicker of panic flashed across her face. "Governor, that's not what this is," she insisted. Everett raised a hand, a small, firm gesture that cut off whatever excuse she was about to offer. "I'm not interested in justifications," he said evenly. "Imani was invited, properly signed in, and has been nothing but respectful. Yet, somehow, she was the only one singled out." A heavy silence followed. Even the lifeguards had stopped pretending to be occupied. Mrs. Lancaster's face flushed. Her fingers twitched at her sides. It won't happen again." Everett studied her for a moment before offering a tight, knowing smile. "I know it won't." Then, with a small nod toward the security officer, who looked like he wanted to disappear, Everett turned to Imani. "You good, sweetheart?" Imani finally let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Yeah, Dad. I'm good." Everett nodded once. "All right then. Let's enjoy the rest of the day." Just like that, he strolled over to an empty lounge chair and took a seat as if nothing had happened. But everything had changed. The weight of the moment hung in the air, thick and unmoving. The entire pool deck seemed frozen, unsure of what to do now that the atmosphere had shifted. Mrs. Lancaster remained rooted in place, her carefully composed mask cracking at the edges. Her fingers twitched, as if resisting the urge to smooth the already perfect fabric of her dress, to do something, fix something. But there was nothing left to fix. She had lost control. With nothing else to say, she turned sharply on her heel and walked away, her sandals clicking sharply against the pavement. The security officer hesitated, then muttered an awkward, "Enjoy your day," before quickly following after her. Maddie let out a low whistle. Well, that was satisfying. Imani didn't answer right away. She was still processing everything. Her father had stepped in, and the situation had turned in her favor, but that didn't erase what had happened. She still had to prove she belonged. Even though she was invited, the weight of it lingered in her chest. Everett leaned back in his chair, pulling out his phone as if he hadn't just dismantled a woman's authority in front of an entire audience. But he wasn't scrolling. He was watching her, waiting. Imani finally let out a breath and sat down. This kind of thing happens a lot. It wasn't a question. Everett set his phone aside. More than you know. Maddie frowned. I just don't get it. My parents invite guests all the time, and no one ever says anything. He nodded. Because no one questions whether they belong. Then he turned to Imani. You weren't doing anything wrong, but you were visible. And for some people, that alone is enough to make them uncomfortable. Imani stared at the water, sunlight dancing on its surface. You knew something like this might happen, didn't you? Her father sighed, rubbing his jaw. I hoped it wouldn't. But I wasn't surprised when it did. Maddie shifted in her seat, clearly unsettled. I'm sorry. I really thought... She trailed off, her face tight with regret. I thought we were past this. Everett gave her a small, patient smile. A lot of people do. Maddie turned to Imani, her voice softer. I hate that you have to deal with this. Imani met her gaze. I hate it too. But there was no point in pretending this was the first time, or that it would be the last. Still, today was different. Today, Mrs. Lancaster had been forced to confront what she had done, truly see it. And all those silent onlookers? They had seen it too. That mattered. Even if it didn't change everything overnight, it still mattered. Everett stretched, breaking the weight of the moment. Now, he said, are we going to keep talking about her, or are we going to enjoy our day? Maddie perked up immediately. I vote for food. Imani, you have to try the club's fries. Imani let out a small laugh, the tension in her chest easing just a little. All right. Let's go. As they walked toward the snack bar, she felt the shift, subtle but real. She wasn't the one shrinking away this time. And that made all the difference. By the time they finished eating, the sun had begun its slow descent. The tension from earlier had faded into the background, but it hadn't been erased. Sitting at a picnic table near the pool, Imani absent-mindedly swirled her lemonade, watching the ice spin. Maddie was rambling about something ridiculous, probably another one of her wild ideas, but Imani wasn't really listening. Her father, sitting across from her, noticed. Still thinking about it? Imani glanced up. Yeah. Everett leaned in slightly. What part? She sighed. All of it. The way she looked at me, like I didn't belong. The way she doubled down, even after Maddie told her I was a guest. She shook her head. It didn't matter what I said. She had already decided I was in the wrong. Everett nodded slowly. That's how people like her maintain control. They don't ask, they declare. They don't need evidence, just enough people willing to accept their version of the truth. Imani thought about the way the crowd had watched, silent. The way security had acted without verifying a thing. She knew her father was right. Maddie, unusually quiet until now, finally spoke. I should have called my mom the second it started, she muttered. I could have shut it down sooner. Everett shook his head. It's not just about stopping it. It's about recognizing it for what it is. Maddie frowned. What do you mean? Everett's gaze was steady. Most people don't see what's happening until it's too blatant to ignore. That's why so many just stood there. They didn't think it was their issue, so they stayed out of it. Imani exhaled. But it was their issue. Her father offered a small, knowing smile. It always is. For a moment, no one spoke. Around them, the air buzzed with laughter and conversations from people who had already moved on, unaware or unconcerned about what had unfolded that afternoon. Finally, Everett stood, smoothing his shirt. You handled yourself well today, Imani. She blinked. I didn't really do anything. He raised an eyebrow. You didn't back down. You stood your ground. His expression softened. Not everything has to be a fight. Sometimes, just existing is enough. Imani let those words sink in. He was right. Maddie grinned. So, fries and milkshakes next weekend? Imani chuckled. You're impossible. Everett shook his head, amused. I'll let you two figure that out. I've got a state to run. As he walked toward the parking lot, Imani watched him go, her mind replaying the day. Mrs. Lancaster had wanted to make her feel small. But she didn't. She wasn't just invited, she belonged. And no one was going to make her forget that. Because no one should have to prove they deserve to exist in spaces they already belong in. If you've made it this far, you know this isn't just about a moment at a pool. It's about how these moments happen all the time. About how easily some people are questioned, challenged, and made to feel like outsiders in places that are rightfully theirs. So next time you witness something like this, don't just stand by. Say something. Because silence isn't neutral. It's permission. If this story resonated with you, hit that like button, subscribe for more, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Your voice matters. Use it.